A sitting president was captured, flown to a foreign country, and arraigned in federal court, all in 72 hours, all while you were going about your weekend. No declaration of war, no congressional vote, no UN resolution. The official charge: drug trafficking. But Venezuela isn't even in the top 10 cocaine-producing nations. So why did the most powerful military on Earth execute its most significant operation in the Western Hemisphere since 1989 for a country that produces less cocaine than Peru, Colombia, or Mexico? This isn't about drugs. This isn't about democracy. This is about a pattern, and you're watching Stage 3 unfold in real time. Here's a number that should reframe everything you think you know about what happened last weekend. 303 billion barrels. That's Venezuela's proven oil reserves. The largest on Earth. Larger than Saudi Arabia. Larger than Russia. Larger than Iran. 17% of all known oil sitting in one country in America's backyard, and until last Saturday, completely locked out of the global market. Now here's the question nobody's asking. If this intervention was about narco-terrorism, about drug trafficking, about protecting American streets from Venezuelan cocaine, why did the oil agreements come first? Within 72 hours of Maduro's capture, Venezuela's interim government agreed to hand over 50 million barrels of crude. Not $50 million. 50 million barrels. At current prices, that's roughly $4 billion in oil committed before the ink was dry on the indictment. And that's just the beginning. The pipeline is now open for shipments indefinitely. Imagine a satellite image of the Caribbean right now, tankers that sat idle for years, suddenly repositioning, heading toward Venezuelan ports that haven't seen this kind of activity since 2019. The infrastructure is damaged. The workers have fled. But the oil is still there. It's always been there. Waiting. Rafael Mendez still remembers the exact moment he understood his career was over. It was March 2019. And he was standing in the control room of the Puerto La Cruz refinery, watching the screens go dark one by one. Rafael had spent 23 years as a petroleum engineer for PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company. He'd seen political chaos before. He'd survived Chavez. But that night, as American sanctions froze the accounts and the tankers stopped coming, he watched a $200 billion industry collapse in real time. His salary, paid in bolivars, became worthless within months. By 2021, Rafael was driving a taxi in Bogotá, earning $35 a day, sending money back to his mother in Caracas. Last Tuesday, Rafael received a call from a former colleague. American companies are hiring. They need experienced engineers who know the Venezuelan fields. The salary being offered $18,000 a month. More than Rafael made in 2 years of driving that taxi. But here's what Rafael told me when I reached him. I'm not going back, not yet. I've seen this before. The Americans come with money and promises. Then the money disappears into contracts and the promises disappear into politics. I'll wait. I'll watch. Because the pattern doesn't change. Only the names do. What pattern is he talking about? Let me show you something most people miss about resource interventions. Pull up a timeline of American military operations over the last 70 years, not all of them, just the ones in oil-producing nations. Iraq, 2003. Libya, 2011. Iran, 1953. Guatemala, 1954. There's a sequence that repeats so consistently, it might as well be mathematical. Stage 1. Economic isolation. Sanctions. Frozen assets. Trade restrictions. Duration 3 to 8 years. Stage 2. Demonization. The leader becomes a monster. Media coverage intensifies. Indictments are unsealed. Stage 3. Intervention. Military action. Regime removal. The point of no return. Stage 4. Extraction. Reconstruction announcements. Western companies. Resource agreements. Venezuela just entered Stage 4. And here's what most people get wrong about this moment. They think the intervention was the climax. They think the drama is over. The president is captured. Justice is served. Story complete. But Stage 4 is where the real story begins. Stage 4 is where $100 billion changes hands. Stage 4 is where fortunes are made and nations are reshaped. And Stage 4 has consequences that ripple for decades. Consider the contrast. While Raphael debates whether to return to an industry that destroyed his savings, someone else is already counting profits. Harrison Blake is 44 years old, a managing partner at an energy-focused private equity firm in Houston. I spoke to 3 people who work in his office. On Saturday morning, while Maduro was being loaded onto a helicopter, Harrison was on a conference call with investors. By Sunday evening, his firm had committed $340 million to Venezuelan asset acquisition. By Monday, they'd identified 6 production facilities available for partnership agreements. Harrison's projected return on that weekend's work, $89 million in personal, carried interest over 5 years. That's not a salary. That's not a bonus. That's the profit from being positioned at exactly the right moment when a country's resources become available. Raphael lost everything in 2019 when Venezuela's oil was locked away. Harrison will make generational wealth in 2026 because that same oil is being unlocked. Same resource, same moment. Different sides of the pattern. And here's the question that should keep you watching. Why was Harrison ready? Why did his firm have capital allocated targets, identified legal frameworks, prepared all before anyone knew the intervention was coming? The answer involves something I'll show you in detail later in this video. But for now, understand this: the pattern is predictable, not the exact date, not the specific operation, but the sequence, the stages, the economic logic underneath the headlines. Some people see Stage 1 and Stage 2 and understand what Stage 3 means. They position accordingly. They wait. And when the weekend comes, when the helicopters touch down, and the president is captured, and the world is still catching up, they're already on the phone with investors. Your opinion of gravity doesn't stop you from falling. And your opinion of the pattern doesn't stop it from unfolding. Right now, there are 7 nations in Stage 1 or Stage 2 of this cycle. 7 countries being isolated, demonized, prepared. Their leaders don't know the timeline. Their citizens don't see the sequence. But the capital is already being allocated. The targets are already being identified. The phone calls are already happening. Venezuela was the proof of concept. The demonstration that Stage 3 can be executed in 72 hours with minimal resistance and maximum speed. The next intervention won't be surprising to the people who understand the pattern. The question is, will you be one of them? Let me tell you about Saddam Hussein. Not the monster you remember from the news. The other one. The one who existed before he became useful as a monster. In 1983, Donald Rumsfeld flew to Baghdad as a special envoy for President Reagan. There's a photograph, you can find it in 30 seconds online, of Rumsfeld, shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, smiling, building a partnership. At that exact moment, Saddam was using chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers. American intelligence knew. They provided the satellite imagery that helped Iraq target those attacks. Saddam was gassing human beings, and America was helping him aim. He wasn't called a dictator then. He was called an ally. For the entire decade of the 1980s, while Saddam crushed internal dissent, while he gassed Kurdish villages, while he built the authoritarian apparatus that would later justify invasion, he remained America's partner. Billions in agricultural credits, military intelligence sharing, diplomatic support at the United Nations. The moral argument didn't apply because the strategic interest wasn't threatened. So when did Saddam become Hitler? When did the monster narrative begin? August 1990. Iraq invaded Kuwait. But here's what most people get wrong about that invasion. It wasn't the territorial aggression that triggered the response. Jordan had seized territory. Israel had seized territory. Turkey had invaded Cyprus. None of them faced the coalition that formed against Iraq. What triggered the response was what Saddam did next. He announced that Iraq would price its oil in currencies other than dollars. He threatened the petrodollar system directly, and within 6 months. To understand what happened in Venezuela, you need to understand a system that most people have never heard of, even though it touches every dollar in their wallet, every gallon of gas in their tank, every import on every shelf in every store they've ever walked into. The petrodollar system. Born in 1974, still running today. The invisible architecture underneath the global economy. Here's how it works in simple terms. Imagine you run a business, a very specific business. You're the only one who prints money dollars, and you've made a deal with the guy who controls the gas station. Every customer who wants to buy gas anywhere in the world has to use your dollars to pay for it. Doesn't matter if they're in Tokyo or Berlin or Sao Paulo. They need your currency. What does that mean for you? It means everyone on Earth needs to hold your dollars. Everyone needs to buy your dollars. Everyone needs to keep your dollars valuable, because without them, they can't heat their homes or run their factories or move their goods. You've turned your currency into a global necessity. Not because of gold, not because of military force alone, because of oil. That's the petrodollar system. And it was designed in a specific moment of American vulnerability. 1971, Richard Nixon ended the gold standard. The dollar was no longer backed by anything physical, just faith, just the promise of the U.S. government. Inflation spiked. Confidence shook. For the first time since World War II, American monetary dominance looked fragile. Then came the solution. In 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger negotiated a deal with Saudi Arabia. The terms were elegant. Saudi Arabia would price all its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. In exchange, America would provide military protection and weapon sales. Within years, OPEC followed. Every major oil-producing nation agreed to the same terms. Picture a map of global oil flows, tankers moving across every ocean, pipelines crossing every continent. And imagine every single transaction denominated in one currency. That's what was built. The Federal Reserve didn't just print America's money anymore. It printed the world's oil money, and that meant the world needed dollars like it needed oxygen. The numbers tell the story. Today, the global oil market trades approximately 100 million barrels per day. That's $7 billion in transactions every 24 hours. According to the Bank for International Settlements, the central bank of central banks, roughly 80% of those transactions are settled in U.S. dollars. That's not market preference, that's architectural design. 50 years of guaranteed demand for American currency, regardless of what the Federal Reserve prints, regardless of deficits, regardless of debt. But here's what most people get wrong about this system. They think it runs on cooperation. They think oil-producing nations chose the dollar because it's stable, trustworthy, convenient. It runs on enforcement. Let me introduce you to someone who learned that lesson personally. Ahmed Zaki was 41 years old in 2011, a mid-level official in Libya's central bank. His job was mundane foreign exchange reserves, currency management, the technical plumbing of national finance. But Ahmed had a front-row seat to something that would change his understanding of power forever. In 2009, Muammar Gaddafi proposed a radical idea, the gold dinar, a new currency backed by Libya's substantial gold reserves, designed to replace the dollar for oil transactions across Africa. Gaddafi toured African capitals promoting the concept. He had $7 billion in physical gold to back it. He had the largest oil reserves on the continent. Ahmed remembers the exact meeting where senior officials discussed the proposal. Everyone was excited, he told me. It felt like liberation, like Africa could finally trade on its own terms. We didn't understand what we were threatening. 2 years later, NATO aircraft were bombing Tripoli. Gaddafi was dead in a ditch. Libya's gold reserves, the foundation of the dinar proposal, vanished. To this day, no one has provided a full accounting of where that gold went. Ahmed fled to Tunisia with his family in 2011. He now works as an accountant in a small firm, earning a fraction of his former salary. When I asked him if he thinks the gold dinar proposal caused the intervention, he paused for a long time. I think, he said carefully, that some ideas are more dangerous than armies. That's the mechanism. Not conspiracy, not secret plots, just architecture and enforcement. The petrodollar system works because challenging it carries consequences. Those consequences don't need to be announced. They just need to be demonstrated. Remember Harrison Blake from Part 1. The private equity partner who had $340 million ready to deploy the weekend Maduro was captured. Harrison didn't get lucky. He understood the mechanism. There are maybe 200 people in energy finance who really understand how this works, someone in his network told me. They watch the same signals, sanctions escalating, demonization intensifying, indictments being prepared. When you see Stage 1 and Stage 2, you start positioning for Stage 3. It's not inside information, it's pattern recognition. The pattern is public. Most people just don't know how to read it. That's the second layer of the mechanism. The intervention cycle isn't hidden. It unfolds in plain sight, documented in newspapers and government statements and UN resolutions. But it unfolds slowly enough, 3 to 8 years in Stage 1, another 2 to 5 in Stage 2, that most observers lose the thread. They see isolated events. They don't see the sequence. Here's a question that reveals the mechanism clearly. Why was Venezuela producing only 800,000 barrels per day when it sits on 303 billion barrels of reserves? That's less than 1% of global output from the country with the largest reserves on Earth. It's like owning the biggest farm in the county and harvesting one row of crops. It makes no economic sense unless you understand that the production collapse wasn't an accident. It was Stage 1 in action. Sanctions froze Venezuela's access to international financial systems. Oil service companies, the specialists who maintain wells and refineries, were prohibited from operating there. Spare parts couldn't be imported. Technical expertise fled. The infrastructure that took decades to build deteriorated in years. Maria Gonzalez was a maintenance supervisor at the Cardón refinery from 2008 to 2018. She watched the decay happen in real time. First, we couldn't get replacement valves. Then we couldn't get lubricants. Then the foreign engineers left, and we tried to improvise. By 2017, we were cannibalizing equipment from one unit to keep another running. Everyone knew it was temporary. Everyone knew we were just slowing down the collapse. Maria left Venezuela in 2019. She now works at a refinery in Texas, maintaining American equipment with American parts for an American company. Same skills, same expertise, different flag. The mechanism created the collapse. The collapse created the preconditions. The preconditions justified the intervention. And now the same companies that were prohibited from operating in Venezuela are being invited back to fix the infrastructure that sanctions destroyed. This is not irony. This is design. The cycle has a logic. The logic has a purpose. The purpose has beneficiaries. And those beneficiaries were ready the moment Maduro's helicopter lifted off from Caracas. But here's what even the pattern watchers didn't fully anticipate. What happens when Stage 3 is executed so quickly, so cleanly, so publicly, that every other nation in Stage 1 and Stage 2 sees it happen in real time? The answer involves something I'll show you next. Something about what the intervention revealed, not about Venezuela, but about the rules themselves. Because when a sitting president can be captured in 72 hours with no international consequence, the pretense falls away. And what's left underneath is something much colder than anyone expected. Let me tell you about Saddam Hussein, not the monster you saw on television. The other one. The one who existed before he became useful as a monster. In December 1983, Donald Rumsfeld flew to Baghdad as a special envoy for President Reagan. There's a photograph you can find in 30 seconds, Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein. Both men smiling, building a partnership. At that exact moment, Saddam was using chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers. American intelligence knew. They provided the satellite imagery that helped Iraq target those attacks. Saddam was gassing human beings with American help. He wasn't called a dictator. He was called an ally. For the entire decade of the 1980s, while Saddam crushed internal dissent, while he gassed Kurdish villages at Halabja, 5,000 civilians dead in a single day, while he built the authoritarian apparatus that would later justify invasion, he remained America's strategic partner. billions in agricultural credits, military intelligence sharing, diplomatic cover at the United Nations. The moral argument didn't apply because the strategic interest wasn't threatened. So, when did Saddam become Hitler? When did the monster narrative begin? The first twist most people miss happened in 1990. Yes, Iraq invaded Kuwait. But here's what's never discussed. Jordan had seized territory. Israel had seized territory. Turkey had invaded Cyprus. Indonesia had annexed East Timor. None of them faced the coalition that formed against Iraq. What made Saddam different wasn't the invasion. It was what he announced 3 months later. Iraq would begin pricing its oil in currencies other than dollars. The petrodollar system, the architecture Ahmed Zaki watched collapse Libya. The mechanism that Maria Gonzalez saw strangle Venezuela was being challenged directly by a nation with the world's second-largest oil reserves. 6 months later, Operation Desert Storm began. Pause this video for a moment and consider that timeline. Saddam was an ally while gassing Kurds. He became an enemy when he threatened the currency system, the moral narrative weapons of mass destruction, human rights democracy that came later. The decision came first. Remember what someone in Harrison Blake's network told me? The pattern is public. Most people just don't know how to read it. This is what reading the pattern looks like. You stop listening to the justification. You start watching the sequence. Now let me show you the second twist. It's about Muammar Gaddafi, but not the version you think. In 2003, Gaddafi did something remarkable. He voluntarily gave up Libya's nuclear weapons program. He opened his facilities to international inspectors. He paid compensation for the Lockerbie bombing. He was by every measure cooperating with the international community. The reward was immediate. Sanctions were lifted. Diplomatic relations restored. In 2004, Prime Minister Tony Blair flew to Tripoli to shake Gaddafi's hand. Another photograph you can find easily. Another smile. Another partnership. In 2009, Gaddafi addressed the United Nations General Assembly. Libya was welcomed back into the community of nations. So what changed? Ahmed Zaki told you part of it. The gold dinar proposal. But there's more. In 2010, Gaddafi announced that Libya would demand payment in gold for its oil, not dollars, not euros, gold. He began lobbying other African nations to join a gold-backed monetary system that would bypass Western currencies entirely. He had $7 billion in physical gold reserves. He had the largest oil reserves in Africa. He had momentum. 18 months later, NATO aircraft were bombing Tripoli. Rebels funded and armed by Western intelligence agencies were hunting Gaddafi through the streets. He died in a drainage pipe, beaten and shot by a mob. Here's what most people get wrong about Libya. They remember the humanitarian intervention. They remember the UN resolution about protecting civilians. They don't remember that the first major act of the rebel government before the fighting was even finished was establishing a new central bank. They don't remember that Libya's gold reserves were never fully accounted for after Gaddafi's death. The leader who gave up his nuclear weapons was killed. The leader who kept his nuclear weapons, Kim Jong-un, is still in power. Draw your own conclusions about what lesson other nations learned. But here's the part that should make you angry. The part that reveals what this system actually costs. Fatima al-Rashid was 34 years old when NATO began bombing Tripoli. She was a pediatric nurse at the Al-Jala Hospital, the largest children's medical facility in the country. Before 2011, Libya had the highest standard of living in Africa. Free healthcare, free education, the highest literacy rate on the continent. Fatima earned $1,800 a month, exceptional by regional standards, and her hospital had equipment that rivaled European facilities. I reached Fatima through a medical NGO last year. She now works at a clinic in Tunisia, earning $400 a month. The Al-Jala hospital was damaged in the bombing and never fully rebuilt. Libya's healthcare system collapsed along with the government. Child mortality rates that had been declining for decades reversed. We had everything, Fatima told me. Not perfect, but functioning. Schools, hospitals, security. Now there are two governments, three militias, and children dying from diseases we had eliminated 20 years ago. The people who made the decision to bomb us, do they know what they destroyed? Do they care? The people who made the decision are still in power, still giving speeches, still writing memoirs that sell for millions. Hillary Clinton laughed on camera when she heard about Gaddafi's death. "We came, we saw he died," she said, paraphrasing Julius Caesar. That's the rage moment. That's the asymmetry this system creates. When the intervention succeeds, the architects get book deals and speaking fees. When the intervention fails, when nations collapse into chaos, when children die in hospitals that used to function when millions of refugees flood across borders, nobody is held accountable. The cost is externalized. The cost is paid by people like Fatima, like Ahmed, like the Venezuelan workers, who watched their industry collapse under sanctions. They had no power to change. The pattern doesn't care about them. The pattern only cares about the resources. Now let me connect this directly to Venezuela. Because everything I've shown you, Saddam's journey from ally to monster, Gaddafi's reward for cooperation. The real timeline beneath the moral narrative, all of it applies to what happened last weekend. Nicolas Maduro has been president since 2013. The indictments against him, narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, are based on evidence that allegedly stretches back decades. So here's the question. Why now? Why was Maduro tolerable for 12 years, and then suddenly intolerable in January 2026? The answer is China. Imagine a chart showing Chinese investment in Venezuela from 2007 to 2024. The line climbs steadily, $5 billion, then $20 billion, then $50 billion in oil for loan agreements. Chinese state companies weren't just buying Venezuelan crude. They were financing the infrastructure, operating the wells, building a parallel system that bypassed the petrodollar entirely. Venezuela was doing exactly what Saddam did, exactly what Gaddafi did. It was threatening the architecture, not with armies or weapons, but with contracts and currencies. And just like Saddam, just like Gaddafi, the moral narrative arrived on schedule. Carmen Delgado understands this better than most analysts. She's 52, a former economist at Venezuela's central bank, now teaching at a university in Madrid. She tracked the Chinese deals for years. Everyone knew it was dangerous, Carmen told me. You could see the pattern. We would joke about it darkly. Are we Libya yet? Are we Iraq yet? When the sanctions intensified, when the indictments were announced, some of us started making plans. Not because we loved Maduro, because we recognized the sequence. Carmen left Venezuela in 2019. Her brother stayed. He works for PDVSA, or what remains of it. Last week he called to tell her that American consultants are already in the building. New contracts are being drafted. The oil that was locked out of global markets for 7 years is about to flow again. Same oil, Carmen said. Same infrastructure. Different flags on the paperwork. That's all that changed. That's all that ever changes. The morality of the leader is irrelevant to the intervention decision. It's only relevant to the intervention justification. Bad actors who support American interests remain allies. Bad actors who challenge American interests become targets. And here's the final twist, the one that makes everything else click into place. Trump said he canceled the second wave of attacks on Venezuela. The operation is being called a success. Clean, quick, minimal casualties. But the pattern doesn't end at stage 3. There's a stage 4 that unfolds over years. There's a stage 5 that nobody talks about because it reveals what success actually costs. Iraq had reconstruction promises too. So did Libya. What happened next in those countries isn't a footnote. It's a preview. And the consequences have already begun. Nations don't collapse in a single moment. They bleed out slowly, one decision at a time, until the day everyone realizes the patient has been dead for years. Let me show you what stage 4 actually looks like. Not the press conferences. Not the reconstruction announcements. The reality that unfolds over decades while the world moves on to the next headline. Iraq, 2003. The invasion took 3 weeks. The occupation lasted 8 years. The consequences are still unfolding 22 years later. Before the intervention, Iraq produced 2.5 million barrels of oil per day. The stated goal was to increase that to 6 million barrels within 5 years, flood the market. Lower global prices break OPEC's influence. 20 years later, Iraq produces 4.4 million barrels per day. They never hit the target. The infrastructure that was supposed to be rebuilt was looted, bombed, neglected. The oil that was supposed to pay for reconstruction instead paid for security contractors, military operations, and interest on loans that ordinary Iraqis never agreed to. Picture a graph comparing Iraqi oil revenue from 2003 to 2023. The money flows out of the ground, over $1 trillion in total. Now picture where that money went. Not to schools, not to hospitals, not to the electrical grid that still can't keep the lights on in Baghdad during summer. It went to contracts. American contracts, British contracts, contracts written in English negotiated in hotel rooms in Dubai, signed by officials appointed by occupation authorities. That's stage 4, extraction dressed up as reconstruction. Mustafa al-Kadhimi was 19 years old when American tanks rolled into Baghdad. He remembers standing on his roof watching the statues fall, feeling something he thought was hope. His father was an engineer at the Baiji refinery, the largest in Iraq, earning $800 a month under Saddam's government. Not wealthy, but stable. Enough to imagine a future. By 2006, Mustafa's father was dead, killed by a car bomb targeting refinery workers. The Baiji facility was contested territory fought over by militias, bombed repeatedly, abandoned for years. Mustafa fled to Jordan, then Turkey, then Germany. He now works as a delivery driver in Berlin, earning $100 a month. He's 41 years old. He sends $400 home every month to his mother, who still lives in a Baghdad neighborhood with electricity 4 hours a day. They told us it would be better, Mustafa said when I spoke with him. They told us the oil would make us rich. The oil made someone rich. Not us. Never us. Now let me show you who it did make rich. David Chen, no relation to Harrison Blake though, they move in the same circles, was a junior analyst at a defense contractor in 2003. He was 29 years old, earning $65,000 a year processing logistics paperwork for military shipments. When the Iraq contracts started flowing, David transferred to the Reconstruction Division. His company won $2.3 billion in infrastructure projects over the next 5 years. By 2013, David was a vice president. By 2023, he was running his own consulting firm specializing in post-conflict resource development. His net worth today, $34 million. His company is currently bidding on Venezuelan contracts. Same war, same oil, same decade. Mustafa delivers packages in Berlin. David flies business class to Caracas. That's not an accident. That's the architecture working exactly as designed. But here's what most people get wrong about the long-term consequences. They think the damage is obvious. Bombs, displacement, visible destruction. The real damage is invisible. It's what doesn't get built. It's the generation that doesn't get educated. It's the infrastructure that decays 1 year at a time until nobody remembers it ever worked. Libya tells this story even more clearly. Before 2011, Libya had the highest Human Development Index in Africa. Free healthcare, free education, a literacy rate above 90%. The Great Man-Made River. An engineering project that brought water to the desert was considered one of the most ambitious infrastructure achievements in the developing world. Remember Fatima al-Rashid, the pediatric nurse who watched her hospital get bombed. Let me tell you what happened to the health system she was part of. In 2010, Libya had 37 hospitals with functional intensive care units. By 2015, that number was 11. By 2020, it was 6. Today, Libyans with serious illnesses fly to Tunisia or Turkey for treatment if they can afford it. The pharmaceutical supply chain collapsed. Equipment couldn't be maintained. Doctors fled. Fatima's trajectory over the next decade is already written. She's 57 now. She'll retire in Tunisia on a pension worth $180 a month if the clinic she works for stays solvent. She'll never practice medicine in Libya again. The children she could have treated, the nurses, she could have trained, the system she could have strengthened, none of that will happen. That's the invisible cost. The futures that never arrive. Meanwhile, the oil kept flowing. Libya's National Oil Corporation resumed production within months of Gaddafi's death. By 2023, output had recovered to 1.2 million barrels per day. Over $200 billion in oil revenue has been generated since the intervention. Where did it go? Into two rival governments, into militias that control territory like feudal lords, into bank accounts in Dubai and Geneva and London, into a civil war that never quite ends and never quite resolves. The oil wealth that was supposed to benefit ordinary Libyans instead fuels the chaos that traps them. Andrew Whitmore understood this dynamic before most analysts. He's 54, a former World Bank economist who specialized in post-conflict reconstruction. He was sent to Libya in 2012 to assess development needs. What he found shook his faith in the entire enterprise. The money was flowing, Andrew told me, but it was flowing through broken pipes. Every ministry had been gutted. Every institution had been dismantled. You can't reconstruct a country by writing checks. You need functional bureaucracies, trained personnel, legitimate authority. None of that existed. So the checks got cashed and the reconstruction never happened. Andrew left the World Bank in 2018. He now teaches at a university in London and consults for NGOs trying to document what went wrong. His projection for Venezuela is bleak. The infrastructure destruction is worse than Libya, he said. The institutional decay is worse than Iraq, and the speed of the intervention means there's no transition plan, no trained alternative government, no capacity to absorb reconstruction funds even if they were spent honestly, which they won't be. Let me give you the 10-year trajectory Andrew is projecting. By 2028, Venezuelan oil production will reach 1.5 million barrels per day, better than the current 800,000, but far below the 3 million peak of 2000. The gap represents lost revenue, lost jobs, lost futures. By 2030, the initial wave of American investment will have extracted returns and moved on. The easy oil, the reserves with intact infrastructure, will be producing. The harder projects will be delayed indefinitely. By 2035, Venezuela will look like Libya does today. Functional enough to export resources. Broken enough that ordinary citizens see none of the benefit. A gas station with a failed state attached. Rafael Mendez, the petroleum engineer driving taxis in Bogotá. The man who said he'd wait and watch before returning will be 62 years old in 2035. He'll have spent the best years of his career in exile. The $18,000 a month job offers will be gone by then, replaced by younger engineers willing to work for less. Harrison Blake, the private equity partner who deployed $340 million the weekend of the intervention, will be 53. His Venezuelan positions will have returned 400% by conservative estimates. He'll be worth over $150 million. His children will attend schools that Rafael's grandchildren could never afford. Same country, same oil, same decade, different outcomes. And here's the question that should haunt everyone watching this: who decided that this was acceptable? Who decided that Rafael's career could be destroyed by sanctions he had no power to influence? Who decided that Fatima's hospital could be bombed for geopolitical positioning? Who decided that Mustafa's father was acceptable collateral damage in a resource war? Nobody decided. That's the point. The pattern doesn't require villains. It doesn't need conspiracy. It just needs architecture systems designed to extract value, institutions designed to protect the extractors, narratives designed to justify the extraction. The architecture is working perfectly. But there's something the architects didn't anticipate. Something about what happens when the pattern becomes visible. When countries in Stage 1 and Stage 2 watch Stage 3 and Stage 4 unfold in real time, they learn, they adapt, they prepare. And what they're preparing for changes everything about what comes next. Let me bring you back to where we started. Not the helicopters, not the handcuffs. The question underneath all of it. Why did the most powerful military on Earth execute its most significant Western Hemisphere operation since 1989 for a country that isn't even in the top 10 cocaine producers? You now have the answer. Not speculation, not conspiracy, pattern recognition. Stage 1. Isolation. Venezuela endured it for 7 years. Sanctions that collapsed an economy. Infrastructure that decayed. Workers who fled. A nation slowly strangled until resistance became impossible. Stage 2. Demonization. Maduro transformed from tolerated strongman to intolerable monster. Indictments unsealed. Media coverage intensified. The humanitarian narrative prepared. Stage 3. Intervention. 72 hours. A sitting president captured. A government replaced. The speed itself was the message. Stage 4. Extraction. Already underway. 50 million barrels committed. 100 billion in investment announced. American companies returning to facilities they were banned from touching for nearly a decade. The pattern doesn't change, only the location. But here's what I want you to see clearly. The pattern is not hidden. It never was. Saddam's handshake with Rumsfeld is in the archives. Gaddafi's gold dinar proposal is documented. The timeline of Venezuelan sanctions is public record. Every stage unfolds in newspapers and government statements and UN resolutions. The pattern is visible to anyone who knows how to read it. Which brings me to the final piece. The question of what comes next. Picture a world map with nations color-coded by stage. Venezuela just turned from stage 3 to stage 4. But there are others. Cuba has been in stage 1 for 6 decades, the longest isolation in modern history. Nicaragua is deep in stage 2, with sanctions escalating and demonization intensifying. Iran has cycled through stage 1 and stage 2 multiple times, never quite reaching stage 3, always on the edge. These aren't predictions, they're observations. The sequence is already in motion. The only question is timing. Remember Rafael Mendez, the petroleum engineer who spent 23 years at PDVSA before sanctions destroyed his career? I called him again last week after the news about canceled second-wave attacks. He's still in Bogota, still driving that taxi, still sending money to his mother in Caracas. But something in his voice had changed. They're offering $22,000 a month now, he told me. The American companies, they're desperate for people who know the Venezuelan fields. My old colleagues are going back. Some of them have already signed. I asked him if he would go. I've been thinking about it differently, Rafael said. For years I was angry. Angry at the sanctions that destroyed my career. Angry at Maduro for making us a target. Angry at everyone. But anger doesn't pay rent. Anger doesn't help my mother. Maybe I go back. Maybe I take their money. Maybe I become part of stage 4. He paused for a long time. But I'll know what I'm part of. That's the difference. I'll know the pattern now. I'll know that the money I'm earning came from somewhere. That it cost someone something. That the system that's paying me is the same system that broke me. That's what this video was designed to give you. Not predictions. Not financial advice. Sight. Rafael spent 20 years inside the Venezuelan oil industry without seeing the pattern. He saw events, sanctions, elections, crises, but he didn't see the sequence. He didn't understand that his career, his savings, his future were variables in an equation he never knew existed. Now he sees it. And seeing it changes everything. Not because he can stop the pattern. Nobody can stop the pattern. But because he can position himself differently within it. He can make choices with open eyes instead of closed ones. That's what I want for you. Here's the framework. 3 questions to ask whenever you see a resource-rich nation in the headlines. First, what stage are they in? Look for the markers. Sanctions and isolation mean stage 1. Intensifying demonization means stage 2. Military positioning means stage 3 is approaching. Second, who benefits from the current narrative? The stated justification is never the real reason. Follow the money. Follow the resources. Follow the contracts that get signed in the aftermath. Third, what would you do if you lived there? This isn't abstract. Mustafa's father went to work at a refinery. Fatima showed up at her hospital. Carmen analyzed currency flows at her desk. They were all living normal lives inside a pattern they couldn't see. The pattern found them anyway. Let me give you one final twist. Something that challenges even the framework I've just laid out. The pattern has worked for 70 years because it operated in shadows. Stage 1 looked like diplomacy. Stage 2 looked like journalism. Stage 3 looked like liberation. The architecture was invisible to most observers. But Venezuela was different. The president announced it on social media. He called it the Donro Doctrine. He said explicitly that America would control Venezuelan oil revenue. The pretense wasn't just dropped, it was broadcast. Why? Elena Vasquez has a theory. She's 46, a political economist at a university in Mexico City, and she's been studying American resource interventions for 2 decades. The quiet version required cooperation, Elena told me. International institutions, allied governments, media that asked questions but not too many. That infrastructure is breaking down. The UN is paralyzed. Allies are hedging. Media is fragmented. So the pattern is becoming explicit because it has to be. Enforcement is replacing consent. If Elena is right, the next decade looks very different from the last 7. The pattern won't be hidden anymore. It will be declared. Nations will be told openly align or face consequences. Resources will be claimed publicly, not through proxy contracts and reconstruction shells. That's not necessarily worse. It might even be clearer, more honest in its brutality. But it changes what it means to understand the pattern. When the architecture was hidden, seeing it gave you an advantage. When the architecture is explicit, everyone sees it. The advantage shifts from knowledge to positioning. Carmen Delgado, the economist who fled Venezuela in 2019, who watched her brother describe American consultants in the PDVSA building, sent me a message after our last conversation. Just one line. The question isn't whether the pattern continues. The question is whether knowing the pattern changes anything. I've thought about that question for days, and I think the answer is yes. Not because knowledge stops the pattern, but because knowledge changes how you move through it. Rafael will go back to Venezuela. He'll take the American money, but he'll know what he's part of. He'll save differently. He'll plan differently. He'll teach his children to see what he couldn't see. That's not nothing. In a system designed to keep people blind sight is the first form of resistance. I started this video by telling you that what happened in Venezuela would change how you see every geopolitical headline for the rest of your life. I hope that's true. I hope you see the stages now. I hope you recognize the sequence when it appears. The pattern doesn't care if you believe in it. It doesn't need your permission. It doesn't require your approval. But your eyes are open now. What you do with that sight is up to you.